AITA. My dad and his wife threw my mom's things in the trash and I took them back out and refused to give them back. When I was 10, my mom died. It wasn't sudden or anything. She had been sick for a while, but that didn't make it easier. My dad took it hard, but honestly, I think my brother, he's 3 years older than me, and I handled it worse. Mom was the glue in our family. She was the one who remembered every birthday, planned every holiday, and always made sure things felt normal even when things were stressful. After she passed, our house felt cold. Not physically, but just off, quiet, empty. My dad tried, I'll give him that. He kept working, still cooked for us, still drove us to school, but there was this permanent fog hanging over him. He stopped laughing, stopped doing anything besides working and sleeping. Some nights I could hear him crying in his room. That part sticks with me the most. My dad crying like a kid when he thought no one could hear. Mom's stuff stayed right where she left it for a long time. Her postcard collection lined a shelf in the living room, and her baking books still sat on the kitchen counter like she might come back to use them. Dad wore his wedding ring on a chain around his neck, and he kept her engagement ring in a little box in his nightstand. Her favorite perfume bottle stayed on his dresser, and her old keychain, this little worn-out leather tag with her initials, was still hanging with the house keys. It hurt seeing those things sometimes, but it also felt right, like pieces of her were still with us. Then a few years ago, Dad started dating this woman. I never liked her. She always gave off this weird energy like she was performing kindness instead of actually caring. She'd bring us cookies or smile way too much, but it always felt fake. My brother wasn't a fan either, but Dad seemed happy for the first time in years, so we kept our mouths shut. They got married about 3 years ago, and that's when things really shifted. She moved in and started changing everything. Furniture was rearranged, walls got repainted, and suddenly everything that reminded me of Mom seemed to shrink. Dad's chain disappeared from his neck. The perfume bottle, gone. The baking books, stuffed in a cabinet. I knew she didn't like having Mom's things around, but Dad seemed to be keeping the important stuff, the rings, the postcards, and a few other things, safe. Or at least I thought he was. Last month is when things really hit the fan. I came home from school one afternoon and there were garbage bags lined up outside the garage. I didn't think much of it at first, figured Dad was clearing out some old junk. But then I saw my mom's postcard sticking out from the top of one of the bags. Her stuffy, this worn-out plush bear she had since she was a kid, was tossed in like trash. The perfume bottle, her passport holder, her favorite cookbook, everything was in there. I froze. It was like someone had ripped open my chest. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My dad's wife was in the kitchen when I walked in. She was practically glowing, acting like she'd just done something amazing. I asked her what the hell she was doing. She barely even looked up, just said something about how it was time to let go and that Dad was finally ready to move forward. Like Mom's things were some kind of disease he needed to cure. I didn't even stop to think. I just grabbed every single bag and dragged them down the street to my aunt's house. My aunt's awesome. She's one of those people who will back you up no matter what. I barely said 2 words before she was helping me haul everything inside and clear space in her basement. 2 days later, Dad and his wife realized the bags were gone. They flipped out. She stormed into my room demanding to know where I put the stuff. I told her straight up that it was at my aunt's now and that she wasn't getting any of it back. She started ranting about how I was disrespectful, how it wasn't my decision, how those things were bad memories that didn't belong in their house. I told her none of it was her business. Those things weren't hers and she didn't get to decide what parts of Mom's life were worth keeping. Dad tried to play peacemaker at first, telling me that I was making things worse. He kept saying they just needed some space, that they were trying to focus on their marriage. I told him I didn't care, that they could focus on whatever they wanted as long as they stopped throwing my mom's life in the trash. I don't know what set her off more, the fact that I took the stuff or the fact that I told her she wasn't my stepmother and never would be. I told her flat out that she was just Dad's insecure second wife who couldn't handle being reminded that she wasn't the first. She tried to act like it didn't bother her, but I could see it hit her. Her face went red and she turned to Dad like she expected him to start yelling at me. Instead, he just stood there like an idiot while she ranted about how I was a thief and a brat and how she wasn't going to let me disrespect her like that. She even tried calling the cops, claiming I had stolen from her. They didn't take her seriously since the stuff was literally in the trash when I took it. Still, she kept pushing, saying I was hurting the family and that I was being selfish. I told her the only thing I cared about was keeping my mom's things safe, and if that meant she hated me, I couldn't care less. My brother's on my side. He called Dad disgusting for letting his wife treat us like this and said he doesn't want anything to do with them anymore. Dad's been trying to convince me to bring the stuff back, saying they'd handle it if I just stopped being stubborn. I told him no, I don't care what they do. I'll leave if I have to, but I'm not giving that stuff back. I won't let her erase my mom like she never existed. That's where things stand right now. Dad's wife is still pissed, and Dad's trying to act like he's stuck in the middle, even though he's the one letting her do this. I'm just tired. I don't know if I'm wrong for standing my ground or if I'm being too stubborn, but I don't regret taking the stuff back. I'll deal with whatever happens next. I'm not giving my mom's memories up that easily. Things got worse after I refused to give my mom's things back. I thought maybe they'd just be pissed for a while and let it go, but no. My dad's wife made it her personal mission to push things further. The morning after their failed attempt to get the cops involved, she tried to go through my room. I was getting ready for school when I heard the sound of drawers opening and closing. When I walked in, she was going through my desk, rummaging through my stuff like she had the right. She didn't even look guilty, just told me she was checking for stolen items. I pushed her out and she stormed downstairs, yelling about how I was out of control. Dad barely said anything. He just stood there, rubbing his face like he wanted to disappear. She kept yelling, saying I had no respect and that I needed to learn my place. Dad finally spoke up and told her that what she was doing wasn't helping. She turned on him and asked if he was just going to let me steal from them without any consequences. Dad told her to drop it, and that seemed to piss her off even more. Later that night, my aunt called to tell me she'd caught my dad's wife snooping outside her house. My aunt's got security cameras, and she saw her pacing back and forth near the garage door. She didn't try to break in or anything, but she was obviously looking for the stuff. My aunt yelled at her from the window, and she took off down the street. When I told Dad what happened, he tried to act like it wasn't a big deal. He said maybe she was just checking in or worried about me. I told him I wasn't an idiot and she was obviously trying to find my mom's things. He didn't argue, just looked exhausted and told me to stay out of her way. It didn't stop there. A few days later, I came home to find a huge pile of my stuff dumped on the living room floor. Clothes, shoes, school books, even my pillow. Dad's wife stood by the pile like she'd won some kind of prize and told me if I wasn't going to respect her rules, I could pack up and leave. Dad walked in right then, saw the mess, and told her to knock it off. She screamed at him about how she wasn't going to live in a house where my mother's ghost was still hanging over her. Dad told me to grab my things and go upstairs. I heard them fighting for almost an hour after that. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught her saying something about how she wasn't going to be second place in her own home. That night, Dad knocked on my door and sat down on the edge of my bed. He looked worn out, like he hadn't slept in days. He told me I needed to apologize. He said if I would just give the stuff back, things could calm down. He said he knew it wasn't fair, but it would make things easier. I told him I wasn't doing it. He kept pushing, telling me it wasn't worth all the fighting, that he just wanted peace. I told him the only reason there was fighting was because his wife couldn't handle the fact that my mom existed. He didn't say anything for a long time after that. He just sat there, staring at the wall like he was thinking of something to say but couldn't find the words. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said he wasn't strong enough to lose another marriage. I didn't say anything back. What was I supposed to say? That it was easier for him to let someone stomp all over his past than it was to stand up for his own kids? After that, my dad's wife seemed to get bolder, like she felt untouchable. She started throwing out little comments every time I walked into the room, things about how some people needed to grow up or how certain people didn't understand boundaries. It didn't bother me at first, but then she started getting nastier. She'd accidentally knock my stuff off the counter or unplug my phone charger when I left it in the kitchen. Once, she poured salt into my cereal when I wasn't looking. I told my brother what was going on and he flipped. He called Dad and told him off for letting her treat me like garbage. Dad kept trying to calm him down, saying I was exaggerating and that his wife was just under a lot of stress. My brother told him if he didn't get his act together, he wasn't coming home again. That must have scared Dad because he called me downstairs the next night and told me to stop making things worse. He said his wife was upset because I wasn't giving her a chance, and if I just tried to get along with her, things wouldn't be so bad. I told him it didn't matter how nice I was, she wasn't going to stop until she had her way. I told him if he wanted to keep his wife happy, he could do it without me in the house. The next day, I packed a bag and left. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I called my aunt and she told me to come over. I was barely out the door when Dad's wife saw me leaving and started yelling at me from the front porch. She told me I was running away because I couldn't handle consequences. I didn't stop walking. My brother came to my aunt's house that night. He told me Dad's wife had started moving stuff into my room the second I left. She was acting like she had won. Dad tried to tell her to slow down, but she told him I made my choice. I thought maybe things would calm down after that, but she wasn't done. About a week later, my aunt's neighbor told us someone had been asking about me. My aunt checked her cameras again, and sure enough, there was Dad's wife, standing outside the gate, looking toward the house like she was waiting for something. My aunt told her if she ever came back, she'd call the cops. I don't know what her plan was. Maybe she thought I'd finally give in, or maybe she was just trying to scare me. Either way, it didn't work. I don't know what Dad sees in her or why he's willing to let her rip everything apart. I know he's trying to keep things together, but at some point, you have to decide what's worth fighting for. If he's choosing her over us, then that's on him. I'm just done. After I moved in with my aunt, things stayed quiet for about a week. I figured my dad's wife had finally backed off, but I was wrong. One afternoon, I came home from school to find my aunt pacing around the kitchen. She had her phone in her hand and was talking fast. When she saw me, she hung up and told me I needed to sit down. Apparently, my dad's wife had gone behind my back and called my school. She told them I had run away from home and that I was mentally unstable. She claimed I was failing my classes, lashing out at my family, and might even be on drugs. The school counselor called my aunt earlier that day to ask if I was safe. My aunt was furious. She told them everything, how I was living with her by choice, how my dad's wife had been harassing me, and how the whole thing was just an attempt to manipulate me. Thankfully, the counselor seemed to believe my aunt, but the fact that this woman had gone that far made me feel sick. I decided I wasn't going to sit back and wait for whatever she had planned next. My brother and I started digging around, trying to find out what was really going on with her. I knew she was controlling, but something about how obsessed she was with my mom's stuff felt off. My brother reached out to a few people who knew her before she married Dad. Turns out she had been married once before, something Dad never told us. Her first husband apparently had a nasty divorce with her after she started controlling his life too. My brother found one of her old coworkers on Facebook who told him she used to show up at her ex-husband's job just to spy on him. She had even tried to get one of his female coworkers fired because she thought they were having an affair. They weren't. We found out her first husband had a daughter too, around my age. My brother tracked her down online, and after messaging her, we found out she had a similar story to mine. Her dad's wife tried to erase her mom's memory too, threw away pictures, tossed her mom's jewelry, even replaced furniture that belonged to her mom just to start fresh. She told my brother that when she started pushing back, the woman made her life hell. Fake reports to her school, rumors spread to friends, even tried to convince her dad she was sneaking out at night with older guys. That's when it clicked for me. This wasn't just some insecurity thing. This was something she did on purpose. She didn't want reminders that her husband had a life before her. She wanted to erase every trace of their past and make it seem like she was all that mattered. My brother confronted Dad about everything we found. Dad kept brushing it off, saying people exaggerate things during breakups, and that she wasn't like that anymore. My brother told him he was being blind and that he was letting her ruin our family. Dad just kept saying we needed to give her a chance. The next morning, my aunt's house got egged. 3 big splatters right across the front window and the garage door. My aunt called the cops, but they couldn't do much without proof. I knew it had to be her. There was no one else who had a reason to mess with my aunt like that. My aunt warned me to stay close to home for a while. She didn't trust Dad's wife not to pull something worse. I agreed, but I wasn't planning to just hide out. I went back to our old house when I knew no one would be home. My brother came with me, and we went straight for the basement. Dad always kept old paperwork and random junk down there, and I was hoping we'd find something, anything, that would give me leverage to make her stop. We found a locked box tucked behind some shelves. My brother managed to break it open with a hammer, and inside were piles of old letters, cards, and random little things my dad had saved from when he and my mom were together. Old anniversary cards, postcards Mom had written while traveling, even some receipts and ticket stubs from things they'd done together. It was obvious my dad had been secretly holding on to these things, even after his wife tried to get rid of everything. We took the box and went straight back to my aunt's place. My brother wanted to confront Dad right away, but I told him to wait. If Dad knew we had it, he'd just end up caving to his wife again. I needed to figure out how to get him to understand what she was doing. That night, my dad showed up at my aunt's house. His wife was with him. He said he just wanted to talk, but I knew better. She wasn't there to talk. She was there to pressure him. The second they came inside, Dad's wife started going off about how I was manipulating my dad and trying to turn him against his family. She kept calling my mom's things garbage and said I had no right to decide what stayed and what went. My aunt tried to step in, but Dad's wife just talked over her, rambling about how she was tired of being treated like an outsider in her own home. I cut her off and told Dad that I knew about the locked box in the basement. I told him I knew he had kept those things hidden because he didn't really want to throw them away. I said if he actually wanted to keep those memories, he needed to stop pretending like his wife's feelings mattered more than ours. Dad just stood there while his wife started yelling at him again, asking if it was true. He didn't answer her. Instead, he looked at me and asked where the box was. I told him it was safe and that I wasn't giving it back unless he promised to stop letting her control everything. His wife completely lost it. She started screaming at him, saying he was weak, that he couldn't keep letting his old life control him. She said my mom was rotting in the ground and it was time to stop pretending like she still mattered. That was it for my brother. He got between them and told her to get out. Dad didn't stop him. He didn't say a word when my brother grabbed her purse and shoved it into her hands. She left, shouting that she wasn't done with this. Dad stayed behind for a while. He didn't say much, just kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Before he left, I told him I wasn't bringing Mom's stuff back to the house. He didn't argue. He just said he understood and walked out the door. I don't know what's going to happen now. My dad's wife isn't the type to just give up, and I'm sure this isn't over. But I'm done letting her erase my mom's memory like she never existed. For a few days after my dad's wife stormed out, things felt quiet. Too quiet. Dad barely called, and when he did, he didn't say much. My brother said Dad was still staying at the house, but Dad's wife hadn't been home since their fight. I figured maybe she was staying with a friend or just cooling off somewhere, but I knew better than to believe it was over. Then one afternoon, my aunt called me while I was at school. I could barely hear her at first, but I caught enough to know something bad had happened. She told me to come home right after class and not to go anywhere else. When I got home, she was still on the phone with someone, probably the police. And when she got off, she told me my dad's wife had been back. That morning, my aunt had gone out for groceries. When she got back, the side gate was wide open and the lock was busted. She walked around to the back patio and found one of her garden chairs tipped over with muddy footprints on the seat. Someone had climbed up and tried to open the window to the spare bedroom, the one where I was staying. They didn't get in, but the screen was cut, and there were scratch marks on the window frame from what looked like a screwdriver or knife. My aunt was sure it was her. The cops came by and made a report, but without proof, they couldn't do much. They suggested cameras, so my aunt picked some up that same day and installed them all around the house. I didn't tell my dad about what happened right away. I figured if he didn't already know, it wouldn't change anything. But a couple of days later, he showed up at my aunt's house without warning. He looked exhausted. His shirt was wrinkled like he'd been wearing it for days and he hadn't shaved. He didn't ask to come in, just stood there on the porch and asked if I'd talk to him. He told me his wife had packed her things and left the house a few nights earlier. He said she hadn't told him where she was going, just said she was done with everything. He kept saying he didn't understand what had happened, like he still couldn't believe she was gone. I asked him if he knew about the break-in attempt. He swore he didn't, but honestly, I couldn't tell if he was lying or if he was just too wrapped up in his own mess to see what she was capable of. Then he said something that caught me off guard. He told me that before she left, she had gone through some of his old paperwork. He didn't know what she had taken, but there were folders missing from his desk. I asked him what was in them, and he said they were old bank statements, bills, and some legal documents from when he and my mom were still together. I didn't understand why she'd want those, but I knew whatever it wasn't good. A few days later, I found out. My aunt got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a typed note that just said, "You stole from my family? You'll pay for it." There was no name, but we knew exactly who it was from. My aunt took the letter straight to the police, but they couldn't do much since it wasn't technically a threat, just vague enough to be brushed off. The next day, I went to school like normal. When I got to my locker, the door was slightly open and inside everything was gone. My books, my binder, my backpack, everything. I thought maybe I'd left it somewhere, but then I found my backpack dumped in the girls' bathroom near the back stalls. My notebooks were torn apart, my homework was shredded, and someone had poured water all over everything. There was a sticky note stuck inside my folder that said, "Stay out of our family." I knew it was her. There was no way it wasn't. I went home early that day and told my aunt everything. She was furious and called my dad right away. I could hear her on the phone snapping at him about how his wife was spiraling and that something bad was going to happen if he didn't deal with it. My dad didn't argue. He just kept saying he didn't know where she was. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound had me checking the window, convinced she was going to show up again. I ended up dragging my mattress onto the floor closer to the door because I felt safer that way. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but then I heard footsteps on the gravel in the side yard. I woke my aunt, and we watched the cameras from her phone. Someone was walking around the house, stopping near the windows. They were wearing a hoodie, but even from the grainy camera footage, I knew it was her. She went to the side gate, the one she broke before, and started messing with the latch again. My aunt called the police, and they got there fast. By the time they arrived, she was gone. They searched the area but didn't find anything. The cops told us they'd put extra patrols in the neighborhood for a few days, but that didn't make me feel any better. The next morning, my dad called and said his wife had come home. He said she was acting strange, barely talking, just sitting in their room with the curtains closed. He kept saying he didn't know what to do. I told him she needed help, but I wasn't going anywhere near that house. Later that afternoon, my brother called me and told me Dad's wife had taken Dad's car and left again. She didn't say where she was going, just grabbed her purse and left. By evening, my aunt's cameras caught her again, standing across the street this time just watching the house. She didn't move for almost an hour, just stood there like she was waiting for something. That's when my aunt had enough. She called the police again and told them everything. The letter, the break-in attempt, the backpack incident, all of it. They finally agreed to issue a restraining order. The next morning, Dad's wife showed up at my school. She wasn't allowed inside, but she stood by the front entrance just staring down kids as they walked in. Security called the cops, and they escorted her off the property. After that, my dad finally got serious. He told her she couldn't come back to the house and changed the locks. He told me and my brother that he was going to talk to a lawyer about divorcing her. I'd like to say that was the end of it, but I know it's not. She's still out there, and I don't think she's done yet. After Dad filed for the restraining order and changed the locks, I thought things might finally settle down. My aunt still kept the cameras running, and I stayed close to home just in case. My brother kept reminding me to watch my back, and honestly, I expected her to pop up again sooner or later. I didn't have to wait long. One evening, about a week later, I was coming home from school when I saw a moving truck parked in front of my dad's house. At first, I thought maybe Dad had hired someone to take her things out. But when I got closer, I saw her, standing right there in the driveway, giving orders to the movers like she still owned the place. I called my brother and he showed up 10 minutes later. By the time he got there, she had already started carrying stuff out, boxes of kitchen supplies, some old DVDs, and even a few pieces of furniture. Dad wasn't home yet, so she was just helping herself. My brother walked straight up to her and told her she had no right to be there. She smiled like she was expecting him and told him she was just taking what's hers. When he told her to leave before he called the police, she pulled a set of keys out of her pocket, old keys that Dad must have forgotten to collect, and told him she was allowed to be there. While they argued, I noticed one of the movers carrying a box marked Mom's Things toward the truck. I ran over and grabbed it out of his hands before he could load it up. She saw me and came storming over, demanding I give her the box. I refused and told her she had no right to touch anything that belonged to Mom. She tried to yank it out of my arms, but my brother stepped in and blocked her. The movers clearly wanted no part of it. They stood awkwardly by the truck while my brother and Dad's wife kept arguing. Then she said something that stopped him cold. She told him she had documents. She claimed Dad had signed over some of his things, furniture, electronics, and even some of my mom's personal items during their marriage. She said if we didn't let her take what was legally hers, she'd have the cops come down and sort it out. My brother didn't buy it. He called Dad, and when Dad picked up, I could hear the panic in his voice as soon as my brother explained what was happening. Dad told us not to let her take anything, especially anything that belonged to Mom. When Dad got there, his wife was still trying to direct the movers. Dad barely even looked at her when he pulled into the driveway. He went straight to the front door, locked it from the inside, and told her she wasn't stepping inside again. She started screaming at him, waving papers in his face. She claimed the documents proved he had given her some of the stuff in the house. Dad grabbed the papers and looked them over right there in the driveway. It didn't take long to figure out what she had done. The documents were fake. They looked real at first glance, but the dates didn't match up, and some of the supposed signatures didn't even look like Dad's handwriting. Dad told her to get off the property, but she wouldn't leave. She kept ranting about how she had earned those things and that we were trying to rob her. Dad ended up calling the cops, and this time they actually did something. When they showed up, they warned her that she was violating the restraining order and told her to leave immediately or they'd arrest her. She finally left, but she wasn't done. A few days later, Dad's bank called him. Someone had tried to withdraw money from one of his accounts using an old checkbook, the kind he hadn't used in years. The signature was forged, and the check had her name on it. Dad was able to stop the payment in time, but the fact that she was still pulling this stuff weeks after being kicked out was unreal. Then Dad realized something else was missing. His wedding ring, the one he used to wear on a chain, was gone. He never kept it in plain sight, but after the break-in attempt at my aunt's house, he'd started hiding it in a small jewelry box in his room. He checked, and sure enough, the box was empty. I don't know if she took it the night she broke in or when she came back with the movers, but either way, she had it. Dad tried calling her, but she wasn't answering his messages. He didn't know where she was staying, and honestly, I don't think he cared anymore. About a week later, we finally found out what happened to the ring. My brother's friend, someone who works at a pawn shop downtown, called him and said a woman matching her description had come in trying to sell a gold chain with a wedding ring on it. The guy said she got defensive when he started asking questions, so she grabbed it and left. Dad was furious. He called the cops again and gave them the pawn shop's security footage. They said they'd look into it, but I could tell no one expected much to come of it. A few nights later, my dad's wife sent him a text. It was short and weird. Just 2 words. Look outside. Dad opened the front door and found his wedding ring and chain, burned and twisted, sitting on the porch. The metal was warped like she had thrown it in a fire or crushed it somehow before leaving it there. That was when Dad finally broke. He didn't say anything when he picked up the chain, just walked back inside and set it down on the table. He called his lawyer the next morning and told him to push the divorce papers through as fast as possible. Since then, things have been quiet. Too quiet. I know she's still out there, and I know she's not done yet. Dad keeps checking over his shoulder everywhere he goes, and my aunt doesn't let me walk home alone anymore. I don't know what's coming next, but I'm tired of waiting for her to make the next move. After my dad's wife left his burned wedding ring on the porch, things felt tense, but nothing happened for a while. My aunt kept her cameras running, and Dad was still living on edge, checking locks 3 times before bed and barely leaving the house unless he had to. I started thinking maybe she'd finally backed off. Maybe the divorce papers scared her enough to disappear for good. But my brother kept warning me not to get too comfortable. He said someone like her wouldn't just let go, especially after everything she'd already done. He was right. One afternoon, Dad called me while I was at my aunt's. His voice was shaky, and he told me to stay inside no matter what. He said his wife had been spotted back near the house, pacing the street like she was waiting for something. Dad said the cops had been called, but she was gone before they arrived. That same night, my aunt's neighbor said they saw a car parked down the street for almost 2 hours, lights off, engine running. When they went outside to get a better look, the car took off before they could catch the plate number. My aunt and dad both agreed I shouldn't be walking to school anymore. My brother started driving me every morning and picking me up afterward. At first, I thought they were overreacting, but then something happened that made me realize just how far she was willing to go. It was a Friday. My brother had picked me up like usual, but we had to stop by the store because my aunt asked him to grab a few things for dinner. We weren't in there long, maybe 15 minutes, but when we got back to the car, the driver's side tire was flat. At first, we figured maybe he'd hit something, but when my brother crouched down to look, he found a knife sticking out from the sidewall. There was no mistaking it. Someone had slashed it. He didn't say much after that, just told me to call my aunt while he put on the spare. We made it home without any more problems, but later that night, my aunt's cameras caught her again. She walked right up to the house, pressed her face against one of the windows, then walked back to her car and drove off. Dad had enough. The next morning, he went straight to the police station with the footage, the slashed tire, and the story about her breaking the restraining order. They promised to put more patrols near his house and mine, but Dad wasn't convinced they'd actually do anything. I found out later that Dad also called her brother that night, apparently one of the only family members she still talked to. Dad begged him to help convince her to back off. Her brother told Dad she hadn't been herself for months. He said she was angry all the time, convinced everyone was against her. He also said something that caught Dad off guard. Apparently, she had started telling people that my mom had been the reason her life was ruined. That didn't even make sense. My mom died years before she met Dad, but somehow, she twisted things in her head to make my mom the enemy. 2 days later, Dad's house was broken into. The cops said the door hadn't been forced open, which meant she probably used the old keys she had before Dad changed the locks. Dad's bedroom was trashed, drawers pulled out, clothes thrown everywhere. The box where he kept my mom's old letters and photos was missing. That's what pushed Dad over the edge. He told the cops if they couldn't stop her, he'd handle it himself. They told him not to do anything stupid, but I knew Dad wasn't going to sit back anymore. The next day, Dad packed a bag and said he was coming to stay with my aunt for a while. He didn't trust that she wouldn't try something worse, and he didn't want to leave me alone at her place. My brother moved in too. We figured if she wanted to come after us, at least we'd all be together. It was a smart move because she showed up that same night. Around 1 a.m., one of my aunt's cameras picked up movement in the backyard. At first, we thought maybe it was a cat or something, but then we saw her, standing near the fence with something in her hand. She started walking toward the back door. My brother grabbed a bat, Dad grabbed a flashlight, and my aunt called the cops. We watched through the cameras as she tried to open the back door. When she realized it was locked, she started slamming something against the glass. Dad ran outside before the cops even arrived. My brother followed him, and I watched from the window as they both shouted at her to stop. She screamed back that she deserved to finish what she started. Then she turned and ran straight for my dad. My brother tackled her before she could get close. She fought him, scratching and clawing at him until Dad grabbed her by the arm and dragged her to the driveway. By the time the cops showed up, she was still screaming about how Dad was stealing her life and how I had ruined her marriage. They arrested her on the spot. Dad found my mom's missing letters and photos stuffed inside her bag. Some of the envelopes were torn and one of my mom's old necklaces was broken, but at least we got them back. She's facing a bunch of charges now, breaking the restraining order, attempted burglary, vandalism, and some other stuff I don't even remember. Dad's lawyer says she's probably going to jail, or at least getting court-ordered treatment. Dad's been quiet since everything happened. I think part of him still doesn't know how things got this bad. My brother hasn't said much either, but I know he's relieved that she's finally gone. As for me, I'm just glad it's over. I'm still keeping my mom's things at my aunt's place. I don't trust leaving them anywhere else. Dad apologized to me a few days ago. He said he should have stood up for me and my brother sooner. I told him what mattered was that he finally did. I don't know what's going to happen next, but at least now I can breathe without worrying that she's lurking around the corner. Whatever comes next, at least I know we're safe. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, hit subscribe. See you in the next one.